Does anybody have questions?
Dawn, I have a question. This is Eileen.
Mhm.
When you're putting, are you not using an inner cover? Then you're using just the shim and then the quilt. You're not putting an inner cover on. Is that right?
That's a great question. The inner cover goes on top of the quilt, and then on top of the inner cover, I put a the Pink Panther hot rigid foam.
Yeah.
I put a rigid foam on top of that. So that's a great question. Quilt box, inner cover, insulating foam, and then outer cover.
You put the inner cover on top of the quilt. I've never done that.
I think it can be done either way. I have a Man Lake extra deep inner cover. It's like 2 inches deep, and it's made just for that rigid foam. And so it works like a cup for the foam. So I guess that's why I put my insulation on top of the inner cover. You could do either. Once you get above the quilt box, as long as there's room for a little bit of air.
Okay. I totally misunderstood that. I heard you say was you put the shim, then the quilt, then the inner cover, then this rigid foam. Is that right?
Yep. And yes. And I do it that way because I use the extra deep Man Lake inner covers that have a trough in it for the foam. So it's like a cup that holds the foam. It's okay to put the insulation directly on top of the quilt box also, whichever you prefer.
Okay. But the inner cover should be on no matter what.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Yes.
Okay.
The main purpose of the inner cover is to keep the bees from sticking the outer cover to the top. So they will propolize that outer cover, and you can't get a tool in there to get the outer cover off. And so migratory covers only have that lip that comes down over 2 sides. So you can get a tool in the crack and pop that lid off. So really the only purpose of the inner cover is kind of like an anti-stick for the outer cover.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. I think Kristen, you were in the next hand up.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for all this. It's really useful. I wanted to ask you, maybe you said this and I missed it, but so right now I have a setup that's something like that. And I had been advised to not put I was going to put the dry sugar on as a desiccant and then for them to eat. But I don't have it on yet. But it sounds like probably I should do that now. I was going to do it in December. Somebody had told me to do it not until December, but it sounds like maybe it's a good idea to do it now.
Yeah, I think you could do it either time. If it was my bees, I would do it now because it's warmer out right now. And in order to put the newspaper in, you kind of have to take the whole cover off, spread the newspaper on, pour the sugar on. It takes a few minutes to do that. And also, if you wait until December and the bees are already at the top, then you're putting newspaper on top of bees and kind of squishing them as you pour the sugar on. It would probably be just a lot easier to do it. It's going to be a little bit warmer this weekend. I would just go ahead and do it this weekend.
Okay, and can I just add on to that question? I have like a deep rim cover, and I'm not going to use newspaper. There's a hole in it, and they can come up into this deep rim box. It's like 2 inches high, kind of like that, but it has a floor on it. I'm going to pour the sugar on that. And I thought you said that in your emery shim, you have a little entrance, and that would go right into where the sugar is. That's okay for there to be an entrance, like the upper entrance can go right into where the sugar is, and the sugar won't get like robbed or ruined or anything. It'll be okay?
Yeah, it's okay. During the winter, there's not as many things out there. The yellow jackets are all gone. So it's pretty safe to do that. There are people who like to put the sugar on top of the inner cover with the idea that the bees will go up through that hole in the middle. The thing that worries me with that is if it's a really cold winter, again, the cluster isn't going to be on top of the inner cover. So they would only be able to go up and get that sugar when it's warm enough. And if we hit one of those cold snaps, that's, you know, sometimes we get a week of 20, 30 degrees. I just like to put the paper directly on top of the frames. And then all they have to do is chew through the paper and the cluster can literally be around the sugar.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when you talk about putting in more dry sugar, if you put newspaper down and sugar and they start eating the sugar and they've cleared out the newspaper, how do you put more on? Do you try to put another strip of newspaper where they've already eaten, or pile it on top where the newspaper still is? It's just logistical. It seems hard to resupply the sugar after they've started chewing through the newspaper.
Yeah, I think there's two ways you could do it. One is you could either make the sugar blocks where you it's basically like a giant sugar cube that you cut into. I cut them into like envelope sized pieces, or, you know, 4 by 6 inch pieces. I put plastic wrap in a tray. I get the sugar until it holds a clump. I press it in there and then I cut it before it's dry. And then I have these blocks of sugar that I can put in there. If you'd rather use the dry sugar, I think you could fold the newspaper around the dry sugar like an envelope and just put a little piece of tape on the top of it, and you could just slide an envelope of dry sugar in there. It helps to poke a couple of little tiny holes in the newspaper because the bees can chew, but it's easier for them if there's an edge to get a hold of already. So even though it'll sprinkle and lose a little bit of the loose sugar, if you're putting a packet in there, I would recommend just a couple little small holes. Did that answer your question?
What?
Okay, you can ask it.
How does sugar blocks?
Oh, how thick should we make?
How thick should we make sugar blocks?
Depending on what shim you're using, it shouldn't be thicker than your shim. So if you look in the picture here, that's probably a 3/4 inch shim. So I would make my sugar blocks maybe a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch thick, because the bees like sugar cubes. Okay.
I see Bill has a hand raised.
Mhm.
Bill, you're muted if you're trying to speak.
Can one use store-bought sugar cubes like you would put in a cup of tea?
I think I would read the ingredients on it. I have a feeling that they could be okay if they were white sugar cubes. You want to make sure that there's not anything in there that's a thickener, like cornstarch or things like that, because that's not going to be good for the bees' guts over the winter. But my guess is that most store-bought sugar cubes are just sugar and water.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you mentioned that there was a way to tell where your bees are without the thermal camera, but I don't think I caught what you were going to imply, Deb.
Oh, so that's right. I didn't connect those dots. Thank you, Brian. So there is a way to check where your bees are in the hive if you have a thermal camera. And these thermal cameras don't work if you use a hive wrap. If you insulate your hive, the thermal cameras don't work. But the other way to test and see if your bees are running out of food or having a preference for the sugar that's on top is just to check them. Just to go in there really quick. If you see bees climbing all over this sugar and they've made a dent in it, like it looks like they've eaten about 50% of this pile of sugar, then you might consider adding more at this time. If I had a strong colony and they had eaten half of this sugar, if they had just eaten it 1 month before, and knowing that they grow exponentially, I would worry if I came back a month later, they would have eaten this and then be out and starving. So if there was none eaten last month, I came and checked this a month later, I would want to feed them since it was half gone. Each month, they're going to eat a little bit more than they did last month. And sometimes a lot more. Bill? And you're on mute, Bill. Or maybe the hand is still up from a previous question.
It could be that.
Okay.
Anyone else has any questions? All right. It looks like there's a healthy conversation. Oh, Scott, go ahead.
How do you have any tips for in putting the sugar in without smushing a ton of bees?
No, and when it's really cold out, the problem is I worry, I panic that it's cold out, and I tend to put the sugar in too fast. And so I do often find cubes of sugar with bees smushed on the bottom in the spring, and I feel really bad because I'm not going to put smoke in there in the winter. I think what I would do is, like I said, is you just kind of put it in there like a shovel, and you just kind of put it in where there's no bees and then gently push it across. And what you'll do is like a little bulldozer, you'll just kind of push the bees out of the way. They're pretty quick, and if they're coming up, then they're going to come up on the frames. So it is hard not to squish them in the winter, but if you go carefully and don't just like throw it in and slam the lid down, if you gently push that, then you can move the bees out of the way.
And kind of a follow-up to that, you said that you have that you do it, you check your hives every month. About how many pounds of sugar do you put in every month? And is there a time that you check them more than once a month during the cold?
Yeah, I generally would not check them more than once a month before February. The amount they eat varies actually by race oftentimes. So the Italians tend to build up, they tend to keep really large clusters, and they tend to start building up earlier in the year. And that's why the pollinators love them. It's usually Italian bees that go down and pollinate the almonds in February. So a large colony of Italian bees would need a lot of sugar, and they would be at a much higher risk of starving. There are other bees that genetically regulate their colony size. So the carniolans tend to keep a smaller cluster in the winter. They can be very, very frugal on how much they eat during the winter. They might come out of the winter with honey stores, where a colony that is a different group of bees might eat through all of theirs and starve. So it really depends on the type of the bee, and within a single yard, you can have different types of bees. So that's why it is important to check once a month up until February, and then every other week, particularly those carniolans. When they start building up, they build up really fast. So they might be going along and just kind of not too interested in that sugar. And then all of a sudden they do a really fast buildup of brood, and they're going through a lot of sugar, and it might surprise you. So it is okay to check and make sure they're not running out of food. Cynthia?
I'm one of the new ones. But would it matter what kind of sugar that you use? I have hummingbird feeders. I always use organic sugar for them. Would it matter what type of sugar that you would use?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. It needs to be just plain pure sugar, no powdered sugar, no brown sugar, no corn syrup, just plain sugar. I go to Costco or Cash and Carry, and I just buy the big bags, and I go through a lot of sugar. But don't feed them anything that has starches, because especially in the winter, it can make them sick, and they can't get out for cleansing flights. When they burn the sugar as calories, it's a very clean burn, and it creates very little waste where they might have to go out and poop, called a cleansing flight. The thing that causes more cleansing, the need for more cleansing flights is the pollen. If they're eating protein and eating pollen, then they're going to need more cleansing flights, which is why it's kind of not recommended that you give them pollen patties early in the winter, that you wait until February when the brood needs a pollen, but you don't have bees up there eating the sugar and the pollen and then winding up with dysentery in the hive.
All right, I saw some great discussions happening in the chat as well. So if you haven't checked out the chat, you can look at the bottom of your screen. There's a little bubble with chat that has a parallel conversation in there if anyone is interested. I don't see any new questions coming in. And I did see that Kit, our president of the Puget Sound Beekeepers, just came in. So Kit, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and say hi to everybody before we go into talking about what we do with breakout rooms and what people want to talk about. All right, it looks like Kit is not able to unmute herself right now. So I do see a question in the chat, which is, do cleansing flights happen even in the cold for you, Dawn? And
Oh,
I can activate cold.
yeah, the cleansing flights can happen if the bees are out flying, then they're out doing cleansing flights. So that's always a good thing. And then in the spring, that's when we get all the orange polka dots all over our cars because all the bees are out cleansing. But it is possible for them to go out in the winter if it's warm enough. That's generally the only reason that they would generally come out when it's very cold.